see those as we go through. So yeah, welcome to this leading change on Masters of Change and Organizational Resilience session, and hopefully you will enjoy. So we'll start us all off with karakia, and then we will go from there. So inu tātou. Ko te kawa o runga, ko te kawa o raro, ko te kawa ora, ko te kawa ora. I rongo e whakairihia ke runga, turuturu o whiti whakamaua ke tina. Tina, huie, taihie.
Yeah.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Tihei mauri ora. I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i rau rangatira mai. Haere mai ke runga i te kaupapa o te rā. Ka ringa mai te kaupapa o te rā. Ke hui tahi ai tātou tēnei rā, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te horohoro i ngā o ringa o kātumata moimoi te monga, ko kaitau te awa, ko Ngāti Kia, Ngāti Tau Ara, me Ngāti Whakaue, me Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko te arawa te waka, ko Kiriro te marae, ko Hansine Zambalian toku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tātou katoa. So kia ora, welcome everybody. My name is Hansine Zambalian, and I'm the program lead for Leading Change for Good, but also your facilitator for tonight. We are going to go through a few introductions, just one really, more to go, some housekeeping, a little bit about who is Academy X, and then we'll get into the main session of the night, and we hear from Alana Johnston, who's joining us tonight, which is awesome, around what is resilient leadership and what qualities can resilient leaders draw from. And so we're really looking forward to that conversation as we go through. Then we'll have some time for discussion to questions from the audience. So if you've got anything that you would like to ask, we really encourage participation throughout tonight. It's all about that discussion, and your values are really treasured throughout. So then we can go on to learning a little bit more about what's next, what we've got planned in terms of the two programs, and how to get in touch with us. So as I've mentioned, Alana is with us tonight. She's going to introduce herself very shortly, and myself as facilitating the conversation. And we also have Jana on the call, who's part of our marketing team, and Lisa Whittington-Slater, who's our outreach. So they will both be having some speaking parts tonight as well as we go through. So just in terms of some housekeeping around Zoom, this is a recorded session, so if you don't want to be part of the recording, you may keep your video off, but we do love to see you, see your faces during the session, and we do invite you to actively participate, but we understand if you don't as well. So please, in light of this and just making sure that everything runs as smoothly as it can you please keep yourself on mute unless you want to talk, and yeah, so on and so forth. And also, if you want to ask questions, feel free to add them to the chat. We'll have the chat monitored tonight, and then there's some dedicated Q&A time at the end, again, which we encourage your participation. So yeah, I'd love to see your faces. So I'll just pass over to Jana now to take us through a little bit about Academy X, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Hansine. Kia ora, everybody. Yeah, I won't take up much of your time before we jump into the content, but thought I'd give you a brief overview of who we are. So you may be more familiar with us as the Mind Lab and Tech Futures Lab, who both still exist, but now sits under the name Academy EX. So in short, we're a postgrad education provider dedicated to creating impactful futures, providing education opportunities that are practical, fit with real-time work, and can be directly applied. So that's us in a nutshell, and I guess the best way to find out more about what we do is to listen in and hear what Alana has to say, and yeah, dig into that great content. Thanks, Hansine, back to you.
Thanks, Jenna. That's awesome, and we welcome any questions after the session as well if you have any around who we are and what we do. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Alana now to introduce herself, and we'll get underway with the main content. So thanks, Alana.
Kia ora, thank you. I actually think quite a few of you know who I am already. It's so lovely to see some familiar faces. And for others of you, I can see, yeah, I don't think maybe you've sort of joined in and attended other things at Academy EX, so hopefully I'm not repeating myself too much for those of you that know me already. My name is Alana Johnston. I am the program lead for the Masters of Change and Organisational Resilience. It's a new program we kicked off this year, and so far we've got some happy faces that are joining us tonight for the MCOR program, so delighted to see that. And as I've also mentioned to people on the MCOR program, as we call it, I'm an academic predominantly background, but I've also worked quite a lot in the corporate sort of change environment as well. I've been working in universities as an academic, but also in different sort of organisational environments, pretty much within the change and leadership sort of area. Still always have a passion, and boy oh boy is change more relevant now, change and leadership, than I feel like it's ever been. So yeah, it's such an amazing opportunity to be looking at issues around leadership and sustainability and change within organisations. I returned back to New Zealand just before COVID hit the world. I'm very, very pleased to be back in Aotearoa. And now running this amazing program that began at the beginning of the year. Yeah, very pleased to be here. Okay, so Hansine is going to be my wonderful slide changing person, so shows how bad I am at multitasking. Okay, I very much am looking at this issue as an open dialogue. So I'm really, really wanting and looking forward to getting some feedback and ideas from you. I think that resilience to me is a really interesting topic for lots of different reasons. And obviously leadership is, you know, such an incredibly rich topic, but combining these two kind of aspects I think is a really kind of interesting thing. And so many of our programs at Academy EX, like Leading Change for Good and the Master in Change and Organisational Resilience, very much touch on issues around resilience and leadership. But I think first of all we have to unpack a bit what we mean by resilience, and this is actually being discussed quite a bit. I notice with the people on the MCOR program, so this will be familiar with you guys and some of our people from Leading Change for Good as well. But you know, for others on this corridor tonight, it's you know, I'm sure there's sort of this notion of resistance has come up for you as well. So what do we actually mean when we're talking about resilience? So there's often this idea about meeting adversity, dealing with setbacks, even recovering from trauma. I think it can mean different things to different people, and we need to keep that in mind first and foremost. But there's typically this idea about withstanding something, the capacity to withstand something, to recover quickly from difficulties, and even this kind of notion of toughness. And I really encourage us firstly to sort of unpack that a little bit and to think a bit critically about, well, what do we mean when we talk about resilience? Resilience for who? And what might resilience actually mean? Who does that just mean the lone individual, or is that resilience as a collective consciousness that we need to think about? So we need to sort of think about, when we're reading about resilience, what do we actually mean? But generally, as I said, it's sort of this notion of the capacity to not only endure challenges, but to even get stronger. And I love this kind of Bruce Lee quote that I've come across, you know, and you've probably heard it before, you know, we don't pray for an easy life, we pray for the strength to endure a difficult one. Yeah, that's kind of what resilience is picking up on. And resilience has been seen as this really crucial characteristics for high performing leaders. So it's certainly getting a lot of attention, scholarly attention. There's increasing amount of research. And certainly you can see, this just came up on Friday, you know, in Forbes, why we need resilient leaders right now to tackle the future. Wow. And this kind of article, sort of basically says, how now more than ever, we need leadership that can help us through times of uncertainty. And really, nearly every organisation, it seems, is going to face some sort of uncertainty. And we've certainly seen that. We hear a lot about COVID, the aftershocks of the pandemic, economic ambiguity. We now hear about increasing redundancies and layoffs on an international level, rapid technological change, also, a shortage in talent, who we're attracting, how we retain the right kind of people. So all of these things are meaning that, yes, absolutely, leaders need more skills and abilities, more resilience than they've ever needed before. So I've sort of got a slide here, what and who do resilient leaders look like? And this is kind of something that immediately comes to mind. Oh, wow, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Wow, this person has resilience. Adaptable, certainly, first and foremost, but is it only sort of about the heroic single figure going forth for the people? But what an incredible example. Or perhaps we might think of, just on the next slide there, we might think of our former Prime Minister. Now, whatever your political leanings are, it's very interesting, particularly in terms of New Zealand's response to COVID and the pandemic, how Jacinda Ardern has been seen as having very high resilience, and as an example of that, and having traits that, demonstrate resilience. But, is this something that leaders need to cultivate in themselves in order to sort of thrive in this sort of very changing environment? Do leaders also carry the responsibility for, helping to protect the energy, the resilience of their, team in the broader sense, or within an organisation? But I think I really want to make a point pretty much up front that it's leadership overall is really only sustainable if the people and the teams, the stakeholders around that leader, consistently can support that leader as well. And we'll sort of get to that a bit more further on. Yeah. I think there's also a key thing that we also need to think about with resilience, which is, boy, oh boy, is it complex. And what do I mean by that? It's essentially, it's a very paradoxical process, resilient leadership. Leadership is anyway, but I've got an ancient Chinese proverb here, and I think this encapsulates things well. So when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. So this sort of idea of building windmills in the midst of winds of change. So you need to be kind of creating something positive and fruitful, almost like kind of an alchemist, but you're also in the process of resistance and protecting, so building walls. And it's kind of balancing these two kind of entities. There's also a question I think about, is leadership different, or resilient leadership different from resilient management? Or are these kind of, interchangeable or very different things? So managerial resilience would possibly connote more about, or connotate more about, an aptitude to absorb and learn from external shocks, and preparing to whatever, what else might come. But maybe leadership actually encompasses more than that. Possibly it's more about providing protection from the wind, using that kind of proverb again, and finding a process to even exploit that kind of particular force that might be challenging, and protection obviously is an essential part, protecting others within this process. But at the same time, being responsive, to ongoing unpredictability and any change that might happen there. So I mentioned earlier, forgive the very cute pictures, But yeah, there's this, I think there is an inherent paradox in resilient leadership. And I think this is where things, you know, there's a real complexity there. So resilience is intrinsically paradoxical because it's involving both strength and vulnerability, agency, communion. And so I'm drawing this sort of a parable, an ancient Greek one about the fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows lots of things, but the hedgehog only knows one thing. So leaders embracing strategic approaches, you know, might be more like the sort of idealistic hedgehog, whereas the fox might be seen as being more pragmatic. But really, resilient leaders sort of need to bridge both of these. They have that sort of idealism, but also cautiously exploring alternatives, remaining, you know, close to the detail, accepting losses in the short term, which is, you know, more of that pragmatic kind of fox. So it's almost like a joining of this kind of pragmatic idealism. It's bringing this kind of paradox together. And I think resilient leadership is essentially what I would call paradox work. It's actually working within these paradoxes, but kind of bridging these aspects together and finding a way through that.
All right.
Oh, anyone okay? Yes. So I think resilient leadership requires rethinking how we work through activities, working with others. It's about, you know, not just rationality, it's about empathy, not just stability, it's about flexibility. It's not just what we're dealing with in the present, it's about future focus as well. It's not just about our local impact, it's about the global as well. It's about not just the individual, but it's also about the collective. And so it's bringing these aspects together. Yeah, and basically bridging two sort of essentially opposing types of forces, or so it would seem. So just on the following slide there, I kind of say, well, who actually are resilient leaders? And I know I put a couple of slides up earlier, but I think we can sort of think more broadly about, well, are they first and foremost defined by who they are? Is there some sort of intrinsic thing that a resilient leader has? Are they born that way, or are there values, or is there a morality, or what is there? Or is it more about what that leader might do? You know, and that probably goes back to that thing of a leader's born or made, or, you know, and there's a whole sort of debate there. I think there's sort of a common understanding when you read through kind of some of the things about leadership and resilience, that certainly it's about being adaptable. It's about being self-aware and actually being able to sit back and, you know, say, okay, this is beyond my comfort level, or this is what I'm good at. It certainly ties into authenticity, being authentic within yourself and how you treat others. Certainly transparency, having high emotional intelligence, being knowledge seeking, being curious, and knowing when you don't have all the answers, and how you might go about finding those. Ethical, I think, is certainly a common thread. Being confident, but at the same time, I put in there actually having some humility. Also having the ability to build authentic connections with people. Knowing when change needs to happen, but also communicating that effectively with people and knowing who that needs to be communicated with. And absolutely trust. I think that is seen as very integral to leadership that, you know, has resilience. I think there's a really important issue here when we talk about resilient leadership, and I want to sort of flip that around a little bit and think about, well, what about resiliency and leadership? And, you know, I think that's very much, it's going right back to resilience does really draw from that sort of democratic leadership, servant leadership, distributive leadership, transformational leadership. And what do I mean by that? Well, effective leaders promote resiliency throughout their organizations, their teams, stakeholders, using, democratic, diffuse decision making. That interdependence is absolutely fostered, that's encouraged. That individual agency is promoted, obviously, but there's locally informed decisions as well. That leaders that build resilience also build on networks and cultural bonds, but are also, ready and flexible. And certainly transformational leadership has always been integral to stakeholder engagement as well. And, certainly for any sort of crisis management as well. So I think there's, resiliency in leadership very much draws from these kind of other key areas of leadership as well. And we need to think about, okay, if there's resilience and leadership, what kind of systems and structures and support networks are actually going to be supporting that? And going right back to that original kind of questions, if we're thinking about resilience for who? Is it, resilience for the leader? What is it within a certain organizational context that's actually supporting that leader to be resilient in terms of how they're operating within that particular context? And I think there are some sort of broader questions also, which I'd love to hear your feedback on about, do resilient people actually make resilient organizations? Does a resilient leader make a resilient organization? And again, that's something that I think is really interesting to sort of unpack a bit. I think a group of resilient individuals doesn't really guarantee a resilient team necessarily. There needs to be some sort of collaborative and socially supportive culture that actually helps with that. So I think resilient leadership is very much kind of essential to achieving some sort of collective resilience. But I shall leave it there. I would love to.
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Alana, for that. And I guess that's just setting some context behind some of the discussion tonight. And there's a lot of overlaps that we can see between the notion of leadership and also the characteristics and the I guess the components that we need to be resilient. But I think throughout the conversation so far that you've brought up, there are a couple of things that might be really worth touching on and talking about. And I guess the first thing that sort of came to mind when you were talking about some of the examples of leaders, showing resilience in their leadership styles, and knowing that leadership in itself, there is some good practice around what that looks like, and we don't want to be in a static sort of space all the time. But we've got the example of Jacinda, who has gone through a lot, I guess, as a leader, as a young leader, and in terms of politics, but then stood down because she said, hey, I've had enough, I'm burnt out. So is this something that comes up a lot, being resilient and the notion of burnout? And what do you see as the link between the two, and how can we be resilient but not be burnt out, I guess? Is there anything that you can
Yeah, I think that's such a great example. Yeah, and again, I do find that so interesting. As I said, that Jacinda Ardern has been sort of internationally cited as this highly resilient leader that led New Zealand, whatever political lead, but that's very interesting that she's coming up again and again. But there's no sort of recognition there about that, the burnout. What pressure does that put on a person to have to be the resilient leader through immense, significant change, crisis? And if this is supposedly meant to be the norm that we need to be operating in now, should we not be thinking very swiftly about what kind of support people need within, our leaders need within this kind of environment? And again, it goes back to, what do we actually mean when we talk about resilience? Is it all this pressure on one lone individual, the heroic kind of leader?
Yeah, no, that's it's really interesting in terms of you know, like because a lot of the traits that you brought up around leadership, you know, and being adaptable, self-aware, authentic, you know, having high EQ, transparency, you know, ethical, confident. We're talking about really good aspects of leadership, and you know, like we want to apply these traits and these things in terms of the spaces that we're within. So how you know, like in terms of the linkage to resilience, yeah, what do you see is important out of that? Like, why is it, yeah, so I guess we're talking about good leadership and as a foundation before or after resilience. What do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's good leadership first and foremost, but it's also going back to those kind of abilities to kind of navigate between that paradox or that complexity and sort of be able to go, okay, right now this is what's needed. So, you know, thinking of simple examples, so thinking broader picture, but at the same time, you've got lots of experts that isn't your area telling you one thing, but then needing to swiftly make decisions on the other hand, for instance, and the enormous pressure that must put a person under. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And then going to the proverb that you raised in terms of the wind and the windmill, you know, like I really can see within that sort of that proverb, the connection in terms of systems and replacing those systems with ones that support change. And is that something that aligns well with being a resilient leader, or you know, like, yeah. Sorry.
Absolutely, I think so. And again, I think if there aren't the systems and the culture and, you know, other aspects that actually support that, then you know, I think it would be very difficult for a leader to be resilient in that kind of space as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alana. So what we'd like to do at this point in time is to continue the conversation, but draw in some questions from the floor and any wonderings that you have along this line of resilient leadership. But you know, is it resilience as an individual, or is it resilience as an organization, or is it resilience as a collective? Like, what are we talking about here in terms of going forward and addressing some of these ways that we can move into the very uncertain future, as you've touched on, Alana? And you know, we talk about going back to our safe spaces when we're up against a wall, but how do we actually get going, and how do we you know how do we prosper, I guess, in this uncharted space? So
We've had one comment through from Donna, who says self-awareness would be one of the top characteristics of a resilient leader, so they can seek out what they don't have. A strong, invisible executive or board is imperative.
Yeah, great comment.
and it also brings up the hierarchy and the link to power, because we did have that in the title of this kaupapa tonight in terms of the power of resilience. So it'll be really nice to kind of touch on where you see that sitting. Is it power as in the ability to be resilient, or is it you know, there's a lot we need to talk about within leadership and power and how they interact. But well, first we'll go to Jay. So you've got your hand up, so thanks, Jay.
Oh, kia ora koutou. What is up front in my thinking today, actually, around all of this stuff is how people tend to dance around the thing rather than participate in the thing. So they spend a lot of time generating a paradigm and giving it lots of like cool language and all of these kupu and stuff like that. But it's the ability to be able to action it. And I think, you know, when we talk about what resilience is and define it, then we can speak to it in that context. And then I guess from an ontological perspective, resilience is a story. And so it's the meaning that you make out of it to your own context. So anyway, with that little ditty there, what's really kind of upfront for me is that bridge in between being able to move from the paradigm of thinking about something to the paradigm of action. And that really lands in a space of something that I heard today actually is high level thinking, I think it was. I'd have to go back and have a look at it. But I think he said it was high level thinking as a skill for high level learning. And the difference between high level thinking and low level thinking is that you integrate the things that you know into your disposition or way of being, and low level thinking is when you isolate the facts and you memorize them and you know, go over them and stuff like that. Whereas if you come from a high level thinking perspective, you integrate it into your world and into what you're up to and what you're doing. So therefore you action it, and then I guess hei whakanoa te mahi. And so you normalize it, you normalize those actions from a space of action, I guess. And so that's where I'm kind of coming from this kōrero, is that resilience for me in my space is actually how do I lead it, and how do I show it, and how do I be about it and embody it? Because a lot of the enrollment from your surrounding networks comes from your ability to enroll your team in your kaupapa. And if you can convince them enough that it's worthy enough and of value enough, and how valuable they are inside of that kōrero, then the whole like investment and putting some skin in the game just kind of happens on its own, and it happens really naturally, and from a place where people can come in as they are and not who we want them to be inside of their titles. That was a little bit jumbly, I'm so sorry, but hopefully there was some sense in that. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jay. I definitely think, you know, there's sense within that. And I think that, you know, you're talking about some systems and processes as an individual to be resilient in the spaces that you are. And that links kind of back to who you are and what you bring, and being, you know, confident in those spaces. And I think, yeah, absolutely. Because if you are, if you've been, I guess, resilient, I think a lot of people have said, oh yeah, you know, you're very resilient, and you can withstand a lot of you know, things that have happened. And so again, you know, linking back to the example of Jacinda, you know, that word and her have been used you know, like together a lot. And it's kind of, well, it's not the fact that, you know, it was just the fact that she was in power at that time and all these things happened, like the pandemic, and then she's been, you know, she sort of rolled through with it because there was no other option, and then being seen as resilient. But if you turn that around and say, well, actually there were choices that were made, and there were you know, she could have stepped back at any particular point in time, but because of who she was and what she was doing, she was able to navigate the space in the best way that she can. And a lot of those decisions were based under a lot of pressure, and there was minimal information, and I think that always is going to have repercussions. But I guess that's part and part of being in that space of a resilient leader, and being in that space of being able to go, okay, how can I make the best decisions based on the information I have, and do we have time to get further information, and what is it that, so knowing your own skill set, knowing what you bring to that table, and knowing how you make decisions before you get into those pressure situations will certainly help you to deliver some outcomes more so than if you're not prepared in that space.
Absolutely. I think if I was going to try and just chunk it out some more, if I apply it to context, because that always matters, when you can apply something to your context and you can see yourself inside of the kōrero from in a real like sphere context. And so for myself in the education space, something that I think I have an assumption about is non-Māori being able to connect to a bicultural curriculum. And so therefore there's that, you know, there's that place of higher level thinking where you integrate it into your life, and then there's the lower level thinking where you're just trying to isolate the reo, or you're trying to isolate what tikanga is, and trying to make it into this tangible thing so that you can give it a word and then you can do the actions, but that's that isolated thing. Whereas if you can see yourself in relationship to it, and that's what he was also saying, is that in high level thinking, it's the relationship between the data that you're inputting and then how that outputs. And I thought that was really cool because then it becomes a network of data that makes sense and is relevant to you. And when it's relevant to you, then you already know what you're up to. But the tediousness of low-level thinking is that, okay, if I remember this phrase, I'm going to use it 10 times today, when that goes against the most effective way, I guess, of being a learner. But being able to see it in a context where you're like, actually, this makes sense to me and my brain in this context, and I never considered that I was already doing that already, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a really cool place to be, because I think it's such a gap in education for myself, but we'll talk about that later.
Kia ora, Jay. Beautiful.
I don't know if we've touched on this yet, but I'm always curious about the choice of the word resilience. And I think that kind of speaks to the power dynamics question, because all too often I think resilience is like a one-way, almost surviving word. And if you think about maybe what the model of leadership needs to be more often than not, it's more about adaptability and falling forward, bouncing forward, moving people forward, and helping others reach their full potential. And yeah, I like the word resilience, but I often think that it almost kind of accepts things the way they are, and you survive them without necessarily moving through them. And I think sometimes that's something that isn't recognized enough. And I think, you know, having that openness to learning and willing to bring groups of people forward is kind of a more accurate description. And I don't know if there's necessarily a word for that, but yeah, I always want to call that out, because I think a lot of, you know, women in particular are quite resilient, because they can survive a lot. You know, even the process of being a mother and going through childbirth is resilience. But that's not necessarily all it takes. And I think people need to be coached, and more new types of leaders need to be modeling the full picture.
Alana, did you want to?
Yeah, I totally agree. Sorry, I'm muting now and then in case a little voice comes through. Yeah, I totally agree, Auriga. Yeah, that I think maybe it's sort of become a bit of a buzzword, and it has been. I mean, resilient leadership has been around for over 20 years, but it's really come through, you know, in terms of a topic area, but it's very much emerged very strongly now, and that's understandable. But I wonder if it's not really about resilient leadership, it's actually about something else. Yeah, and what are those other attributes, or, you know, what else are we considering here? But yeah, I completely agree. Angela, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, just thinking about what Auriga said, because I was looking again today at Te Kore Te Pō, the Māori understanding of how the universe has evolved, and just that that it's a place of potentiality, that black hole, and the journeys. There's the long night, the dark night, you know, the night to be felt, and there's a process, almost that three steps of change, really. And also the view of Atua, not as gods but as life force energies, to be worked with and not against. And so it's that idea of journeying and growth and working with, rather. And I guess, for example, the cyclone that's happened now, it's almost like we've been so stubborn about, you know, being able to have control of where we live because of our engineering ability, but we've been proven that we can't. And now we're having to make that shift. And it's so I think of resilience in that way.
Yeah, that's really nice, Angela, and thanks for the the explanation to go along with it, because I think absolutely there's more to resilience, and I think this is where the kōrero is going. So resilience seems to be something that happens because we are in a position to lead in a particular way, but really, as Agura, sorry, I don't know how to say your name. Also
Ariga.
Ariga, thank you.
Ariga.
Ariga, awesome, thank you. Also pointed out that what's this term really? What is it really referring to? And I think that space where we have great leadership draws from many spaces. It's not just one way of being a leader, and their adaptability and being able to shift into that more uncomfortable space of the unknown is actually something that's really important to be grounded. And I think that also ties into Jay's kōrero around that. So it's kind of like, how do we make those really good decisions, and what's in behind what determines what decision we make. And I think those are really good questions, and I think that's what Bevan has asked in the chat as well. Where's the line between lucky decision making and good leadership, and how do we know the difference from observation? So yeah, I don't know, Alana is smiling around that one, so do you want to carry on?
Yeah, it's just a great comment. Yeah, thank you, Bevan. I noticed that as well. And I guess yeah, I think it is. It's almost like intrinsic to some of us. If you think, when you look at, was that actually luck, or, was that actual skill, or was it drawing? Did you have the right experts in the right place at the right time, or, is that person just the sort of result of, what's going on, the context without them? Do they have the right to? And I can't give you a straight answer with that one, but it's like we know it when we see it.
Yeah. And I think it also comes from some really good foundations. Like, so if we are putting things in place, so we're talking about systems and what's in place, and we're looking at organizational structures and what's working, but not only just those structures, because we have them naturally as a human society. So when we try and take them away, we have the tension with, I guess, the chaos, and so we end up putting systems in place to have some sort of order, and then that creates boxes, and then people fit either inside the boxes or outside the boxes. So when we're creating these systems and making these decisions, I think it's really important that we have space to be able to be flexible and adaptable within the systems that we put in place, so that we can get true voice to the table, that we can get change when it's needed and when it comes up, rather than having to persevere. And I think, with there's a comment in the chat around Annie Uelasi is brought forward to the table. She speaks on both MCOR and leading change for good, but thinking about the absence of the need for resilience, that notion of we shouldn't need to be resilient, but if we've got really strong systems in place, we will be able to be adaptable. We will be able to put those good leadership practices in place to cope with those situations that are unknown and that are coming towards us, and make those good decisions based on good foundations of leadership. So I think that kind of, it doesn't answer the question necessarily, but I think it definitely helps steer us in the right direction. Kia ora, Jay.
Just thinking about that is it luck thing, it got me thinking about atomic habits. And so when you implement really small incremental habits into your life, eventually they compound and then tip the scale so that it lands. And sometimes it can look like it happened overnight, but actually it's been a really long journey of really, really small changes of habit that sometimes don't even look like you've done anything different. Like, that's how minuscule they are, but that's the whole point of the atomic habits, is that they compound on themselves and then tip the scales and then land the thing that you're trying to land. And so I'm really mindful of that sometimes too, that it can look like you're not going anywhere for a long time or nothing is changing, and then all of a sudden everything lands in one go. And then if you have been able to witness the journey, you can be like, finally my fruits have come through. And then if you haven't been a part of the journey, you can be like, oh, that was pure luck. But that is purely dependent on the person and how that goes. And also inside of that puka puka, he talks about goals not being how you shouldn't have goals, but rather you should, it's about identity. And now I'm wondering actually if those little tiny habits of 1% stacked upon each other to build an identity, then you build an identity of resilience, and you might even miss the point that you become that. Yeah.
Yeah, kia ora, Jay. Absolutely agree that there's a lot more to it than on the surface, and a lot of dedication. Well, a lot of things that you do deliberately to build into the space, and yep, some things might happen unexpectedly, and those unintended consequences are either positive or neutral or negative, in some way or the other. But if you are putting those things into place, then hopefully the outcomes will be there. And yeah, absolutely, they might move really quickly or might feel like they're taking a long time. But if you are building those foundations, then it's really, really important. There's also a comment by Crete, sorry if I mispronounced your name, around resilient leaders are developed through servant leadership, and again concur, like servant leadership does get a poor rap from time to time, just with its name, but actually in action it's one of the most powerful movements that we've seen in modern leadership, and it's not a modern concept at all, even though it was coined by Greenleaf in the 70s. It really has a much longer serving history, I guess, in terms of a way of leading people and just being really human centric and working around those needs of what people need in order to make good change. So I think you'll see more and more servant leadership underpinning good leadership, full stop. When we start looking at these new modern ways of leadership coming through, like holacracy and things like that, we've got servant leadership underpinning that type of leadership as well. So yeah, sure. Do you want to add to that, Crete? So, yes.
Yeah, I do actually. Tēnā koe, Alana, and kia ora koutou. I just wanted to, just kind of jump on the back of Angela's kōrero just around, she talked about navigating change from a Te Ao Māori perspective, and it's something that is very much sort of the way in which we operate, because I work for a kaupapa Māori organisation as well. And when we actually, because we're in a constant state of change, particularly around during the COVID, like at the height of COVID, our workforce basically were redeployed to become lay vaccinators. And so when we were sort of in that state of change, staff were kind of unsure, like, what is my job? What am I supposed to be doing during this period? And so while everyone was kind of, essentially working from home, our workforce were basically repurposed to serve our whānau need. And so as part of that, we were agile enough to just shift and make that move. But also underneath all of that, we needed to understand from a kaimahi perspective is what are all these, different changes actually mean, and what value am I adding? And so, you've got all these mainstream paradigms, concepts, that's cool, but that doesn't resonate for whānau. And when I'm talking whānau, I'm talking about staff, our staff workforce. And so we actually drawing on the rich mātauranga, that currently exists within a Te Ao Māori perspective, we were able to basically formulate some of those change management aspects around what does it mean to be in Te Kore phase, what does it mean to be in the Te Ao phase, and then what does it mean to be in the Te Ao Marama. And so, I suppose from a Western lens, Te Kore is like chaos, it's nothingness, it's it's an absolute mess. But from a Te Ao Māori perspective, is that being in that darkness is actually where there's limitless potential. And I suppose as a leader, and I'm thinking about my CE here, who I won't mention his name, but he's very much an element of a dictator, but also very much a servant leader. He had actually come from working on the marae for the organization on the weekends, right up to now he's our CE. So he's a very prime example of that servant leadership. And so being able to then equip our staff with a change management framework that was from a Te Ao Māori perspective it actually resonated with staff, and it actually said, oh, cool, this is something that is of value to me, and it's something from which I can see myself in. So yeah, whether you're tangata whenua or tangata tiriti, it actually resonates with you because you know that you're in the do every single day, and sometimes you get lost in that change process. You then become sort of hoha and disillusioned with the overall, direction or strategy. But I just wanted to touch on that resilient leadership is it's something that you talked about, that's been here for centuries. It's definitely an indigenous practice. For me as a Samoan, I know that there's a Samoan proverb that says, "Oleala i le pule le tautoa," which is the pathway to leadership is through service. And that's unique to us as Samoan indigenous, but I know that that's not a new concept for anyone that's indigenous, whether you're Maori or what have you. So yeah, I just wanted to chuck that in there to say, I think with leadership, it's Brazilian leaders, particularly through that COVID period, we actually saw firsthand leaders who stood up and say, this is what we're going to do. And, it doesn't matter, what the circumstances are, we're going to serve our whānau this way. And I saw that it wasn't through, oh, this person's just been appointed, through bureaucrats. Like, this person has actually come through working through in the hard yaka, been in the marae, doing all the stuff that you do, which kind of speaks to the, if service is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. It's that mantra. So I just wanted to add that. I'm also not sure where that conversation ended up going, but just wanted to share it on the back of what Angela had talked about and Jay as well. So yeah, kia ora te whānau.
Kia ora, beautifully said. And I think, it's really, you can really look back and see those connections and dots and where they've come from, and definitely having the mataranga and just the way of being and again connecting to Jay and Angela as well, in terms of just the way of being and way of knowing really comes through, and we did see that through the pandemic and being a servant first in terms of that leadership can really support and open up those doors. So yeah, it's beautifully said, and thank you for sharing that with us tonight in this context, because I think it absolutely fits where leadership is going from and where it can draw from to move forward. So I think those beautiful connections. Awesome.
I have a question. You talked a bit before about like how resilience is a great thing, but in an ideal world, like we wouldn't need the idea of resilience, that kind of thing. And I guess that had me thinking about, when do you say, like, yes, this is time for me to kind of knuckle down and like be resilient and kind of develop those skills, and when you say actually enough is enough, and like it's time for not just resilience but change, and going about whether that's you implementing the change or you removing yourself from that and saying, this that isn't something I can give my time, my energy to anymore, and how you find that balance.
Yeah, I feel, Jenna, you've kind of almost answered that in a way, because if you are having to put a lot of effort into keeping status quo, then is it right? So if you are getting burnt out, and if you are feeling as though, you're having to hunker down and be resilient, then, potentially there needs to be a change, and that can be the way. So I guess going back to that human-centered leadership and having people at the heart, if we're truly doing that, then we're going to be looking out for their needs, and we're going to be seeing when they are being overwhelmed, and finding, again, it's like the thing between leadership and management, because management, we're really looking to keep a system running efficiently, and we're not really worried about what people are like within that system so much. We're just making sure that the outputs are happening based on the systems that are in place. But in terms of leadership, we're looking at those systems and we're saying, are they best fit? Can we do things better? And if we can, what do they look like? And so I guess if you are constantly in that space of being under pressure and just feeling like, it's not right, then go with that. I think, like there's no one answer for the situation. There's no one context to be in. So that's how I'd kind of attack that. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Alana, to that, but good question.
No, I think it goes right back to, is it, if we're considering resilience, is it really about, a collective notion of resilience, or is it about that individual again? And I think we really need to dismantle this kind of notion that it's about us having to be resilient. It's about, you know, what's actually challenging that, and how can we operate within a system of change or creating real authentic value with anything if we are expecting people to just be, you know, inherently resilient, whatever that now means. We've got some interesting comments on the chat. Actually, I just want to acknowledge Crete as well. That was really such a fantastic example. And I think Aotearoa is absolutely, we're at a place where we can really consider, you know, so many different models of leadership as well. And that it doesn't have to sort of follow along that kind of notion of resiliency through leadership. There's something else I think that we can add to that. Yeah, it's an interesting place to be in.
Thanks, Alana. So are there any further Pātai questions, wonderings? Angela.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the cyclone and down at Port Waikato, and we were completely shut off from everything and everyone, and there were times when we had no power. And actually it was the marae and the kura kaupapa that came together and pulled everything together in the second one. And thinking about it, you know, like we can say, yes, it's Māori, but I think back even to when my father talking about growing up in the far north, and Pākehā communities had resilience because they all understood that they needed each other, and they had each other, and they didn't have someone that was going to rush in and save them. And so they had to create resilience as a community. And as a member of the Residents and Ratepayers, one of the things we're looking at now is how do we maintain what was built. At the time of the cyclone, we were all on our own for days and days and having to take care of each other. And now creating a network so that if anything happened again, everybody is able to, you know, go in and take care of things. And so for me, that's a resilient community. We're not just dependent on where's the council, you know, where's Contact Energy. People who had burners shared them out with each other. You know, I had a broken leg. A lady brought me hot porridge for breakfast every morning and a flask of hot coffee, you know, and people provided mattresses and clothing, and we did it all on our own. And so, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Again, it's a great example because it's actually learning from what we've, you know, an event that we didn't expect to happen, although it's not a out of this realm event, and it has happened in the past in terms of cyclones hitting Aotearoa, but not in the way that it has, and not especially in the timeframes that we've had these extreme weather events. And you know, with the climate as it is and the way things are going, we're going to have more of these events. But it's a great example of, yeah, fortifying and developing new systems to support change, forward thinking, so that we're not in that same situation again. So I think, you know, it's a beautiful connection to what we're talking about here, and that adaptability and ability to move forward from the place that we're in, using the concept of resilience. But actually it's going further than that. It's actually taking that knowledge and being able to develop new knowledge from that, and actually put it into place. And I think, you know, someone's mentioned tonight, do the do. Absolutely, that's where the practice comes in, and that's where leadership theory falls over a lot, because, you know, thousands of years of leadership theory, and it's all about you know, looking at ways of doing the do, but not actually in context. And so when we come to apply that theory, there's always a squiggly line, and it doesn't necessarily go how we intend it to. So we may have the right ideas and understandings, but each context is different, and so how we apply it is really, really super important. I think that's a beautiful link that you've just made, from a community aspect of, what's happened in isolation, and how a community can build resilience. But actually, it's not just about withstanding that, it's actually being able to stand up through that and not have the same things happen again and again and again. So that's awesome. Thank you, Angela, for sharing. Yeah, thanks, Donna. Yeah, absolutely layers. And we could be talking about any leadership, I think, is kind of the point of this conversation as well, a wee bit. It's not just about being resilient. Absolutely, there are many, many layers of what that looks like, and it's how we apply them. That's really important to how we go forward. So, cool. All right. This is great. If you've this is your first experience of Academy X, this is what we like to have in our sessions, in our weekly sessions. So we're really developing and building knowledge together. We're sharing our own expertise and having this sort of critical discussion around these different topics, and that's what makes it special, I think, in terms of some of the learning that we have. So that's why we encourage the conversation. We encourage people to share your thoughts and ideas, so that we can see those multiple perspectives coming through. So I feel like we are getting close to the end of this conversation, and that's okay. So I'll just open it up for any last sort of comments or pātai that we may have, but then I might just hand back over to the team to go through the final slides. All right, well, I will share my screen again, and I'll hand over to Lisa and Jana. So hopefully you can see that.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have, if you're interested in joining us on the journey, we have our postgraduate certificate in Leading Change for Good coming up in May. I love the program so much. I've done it, so ask me anything. And we have a session coming up, info session on Leading Change for Good next week on the 18th, which is 5:30 to 6:30. We have, it's a 34-week program. The magic in our programs are we're really non-traditional, but very, very practical. And we have, and you're working towards a strategy of change. We have a range of scholarships, all 75%, Tangata Whenua, Pacific Ako, Taipiki over 60, and Impact for those with the intent to do good for the world, people, the planet. And we also have a intake coming up for Master of Change and Organizational Resilience, which is in, someone changed the, and which comes up later on this year.
Apologies, that is wrong.
And again, it's a powerful journey. You're working towards a change project of your choice. We journey alongside you. We have an information session coming up on the 9th of May from 5:30 to 6:30. Again, there are those 4 scholarship pots, which are first in, first served. If you have any questions, I'm here to help. And we also have templates and other ideas for the 25% balance. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Lisa, thank you so much for that. So yeah, that kind of concludes our session. I just wanted to take the time to thank Alana for her presentation tonight, and starting off the corridor, and for everybody who has participated in the conversation. I think it was a really great way to sort of finish off the evening of in talking about this leadership, and keeping the conversations open, because there are so many benefits that we can have by doing so, and moving forward in that with leadership. So thank you, Alana. It was a great session. Yeah, did you want to say just a bit more?
Kia ora koutou. Yeah, thank you so much for all the comments, and I know it's a big ask kind of at the end of the day, but I really, really valued your openness and your feedback and your chat and some of the great discussion that you brought along as well. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alana. Cool, and thanks to the team for who have been here, and yeah, we'll finish off with closing karakia, just to let you go back into your spaces and places, and life outside of this beautiful conversation. So, ka whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumia, huia, tae, kia. Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora.